Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. I've not been introduced in Arabic very often, so it's a real honor. I'm going to talk to you today about teaching as a research-informed profession. I'd like to start by asking you to do a couple of exercises in imagination. The first, imagine a world where government school teachers were respected and perhaps paid as much as medical doctors. Here's another exercise in imagination. Imagine teaching in a truly wonderful school. What would that be like? What characteristics would it have? How would you express yourself? Would you be allowed to be innovative, creative? While you continue to imagine this amazing school, ask yourself, how are teachers managed? Are they managed in the same way as factory workers, perhaps? I doubt that was part of your imagined scenario. So how does this work? Well, we need rules and we need professional frameworks, but that's not enough. We want opportunities to express ourselves as professionals too. So how might that be possible? Well, I think it's a simple fact that if we compare teachers against other professions, such as doctors, lawyers, and engineers, they are treated differently, subject to much closer monitoring, perhaps most similar to people who work in factories, warehouses, or call centers. So why is this, and what, if anything, can we do about it? How could we improve the standing of teachers? How might we obtain the same respect as doctors, lawyers, and engineers? And how can we move away from really close checking that's often associated with unskilled workers? Well, here's a thought. If we look at doctors and the trusted, well-paid professions that I've mentioned, there is something interesting. There is a commonality, an interest in expertise, and particularly evidence-based expertise. And maybe we can learn something from that. There's a lot of people who believe this, that school leaders perhaps particularly can learn from medicine. And I'll give you an example here. This is Ben Goldacre. He is a medical doctor. But in recent years, he's also been quite influential and written a number of the papers which have influenced particularly the UK government in thinking about education and education research. He says, medicine has leapt forward with evidence-based practice. He describes it as empowering. He thinks it helps to create autonomy. And he suggests that nobody in government would tell a doctor what to prescribe, and I think that's probably true. He also says that he thinks one day teachers could be in the same situation. Now that sounds pretty good to me. So we have the possibility of a more evidence-based profession, and that offers some exciting benefits. Maybe we can depoliticize teaching, and maybe we can free ourselves from being bossed around as much as we are right now. And the benefits, I think, continue. There's the opportunity for more powerful professional development, greater familiarity with improved teaching techniques, potentially better school decision-making, smart approaches to evaluation, so really understanding our practice and the value of it in the classroom. And the big prize, I guess, is improved outcomes for students. Another potential benefit relates to our ability to evaluate what we're doing in a really smart way. So one of the challenges associated with doing evaluations of our practice as teachers is often it can suggest that the programs and practices that we favor, that we feel intuitively are working, actually might not be as effective as we imagine. And there's an interesting case study from some research that we were involved in a few years ago. So this was conducted by Education Development Trust, my organization. We looked at 14 interventions in literacy and numeracy, and we asked teachers to adopt these interventions, one of these interventions in their classrooms. And there were thousands of teachers, about 1,000 teachers involved in this, in about 800 schools. And we evaluated the impact on students. This was set up as a very robust study, so it was conducted as a randomized control trial. So we had a control group of pupils who did not receive the intervention. They received teaching as normal. The chart shows the results, the positive and negative effects of these 14 interventions. It's important to point out that across all 14 interventions, all the teachers believed the intervention that they adopted in their classroom was brilliant. They all were really enthusiastic about their intervention. But you'll notice from the chart, with only one exception, the interventions didn't make much difference, and in some cases they actually had a small negative impact on the pupils. So in these cases, the pupils were not getting less clever, they were still learning, but they weren't learning as fast or in the same trajectory as they would have done had they not been taught via that intervention. So teachers need to know this kind of information. They need to know the impact of what they're doing in the classroom. So there's all sorts of arguments for us potentially putting greater emphasis on evidence use when thinking about our professionalism. And maybe it's an idea whose time has come. It's quite fashionable, and it has been, I think, for a few years now. And we've been interested in this for 3 or 4 years, but it's not just us. There are lots of other people also interested in this idea. For example, I'm sure many of you will have heard of John Hattie, the New Zealander, who wrote a very influential book a few years ago now, which provides guidance for teachers on evidence-based teaching. The book, of course, was Visible Learning, in which he summarizes and synthesizes what we know from hundreds of different studies into teaching practice. And this is the largest ever educational research study based on the experiences of over 80 million students. So it all sounds very exciting, but as with all of these things, there are some complexities and there are some problems, and I'll talk about a couple of these now. The first one is that actually not everybody is convinced that evidence-based teaching is a good idea, and I'll introduce you to some of the critics. The first is Dylan William, and he says that the idea that teaching should be a research-based profession is attractive, but unfortunately it's not going to happen. And he refers by implication to this phrase, what works. So people talk about the need to do teaching based on what works, but, as he says, everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. And he has a point I think we need to be particularly mindful of, that context, when we're thinking about teaching, is really important. And what works in your classroom might not work in mine, and vice versa. Here's another critic, Martin Hammersley. And he says that the idea that research can make a major contribution to improving practice stems from the assumption that it is systematic and rigorous. And this is in contrast with evidence from professional experience, which is often portrayed as unsystematic. And I think that this is another really important point, that what he's saying is, well, kind of hang on a minute, there's a real danger that if we keep prioritizing the really systematic, rigorous academic research over professional practice, we might be missing a trick. There's a lot of insight that can be gained from understanding professional practice and taking that seriously too. And if we think about our colleagues, we all know that a teacher with 10, 15 years experience has probably learnt as much, if not more, from their professional practice than they have from the academic research. And finally, amongst the critics, Gert Biester. And he says that the condition of being a student is quite different from being a patient. And he's referring here to this analogy with the medical model. So being a student is not an illness, just as teaching is not a cure. So maybe when we think about this medical analogy, it's simplistic. It doesn't really work particularly well for education. In a typical school or classroom, it's very complex, and there are many, many different variables that can affect pupils' learning. He goes on to point out another really important risk that we need to take seriously. And he says that there are those that think that research will be able to give us the truth, and that the truth can then be translated into a set of rules for action. And then the only thing that practitioners need to do is to follow those rules. So there's a danger, potentially, that he's pointing out, that actually evidence-based teaching could ultimately downgrade teachers, which is the opposite of what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to think about how we might raise them. So we need to take this quite seriously as well. We do not want teachers to become merely the technicians who follow the manual that was written by the clever researchers. And there's another problem too. There's actually not enough good research in education to think about an evidence-based profession. So education research worldwide receives a tiny fraction of the funding that's available for medical research. Very little research in education is replicated. Pedagogy in non-core subjects has been subject to very little research. So if your main teaching area is literacy or numeracy, for example, you'll probably be able to find some good research which could inform your practice. But if you're a history teacher or a geography teacher or a music teacher, then good luck. Much of the research is also context-specific and not really the sort of research that gives us lessons that we can transfer or generalize from. I'll give you another short example. So the Epicenter, which is part of London University, conducts these big systematic reviews to try and provide guidance for teachers. Back in 2008, they did one on gifted and talented education. And their initial searches identified 21,000 studies that were relevant to the topic. But the final recommendations put forward in the report were based on only 15. So they had to discard nearly all the sources of evidence because they were not the right kinds of research style to provide a script for the classroom. Okay, so we have some possibilities, some potential, but we also have some quite serious problems. So some experts disagree about the usefulness of research evidence, and much of the evidence that we would ideally want doesn't exist. Okay, so perhaps then we should think not about research-based professionalism, but research-informed. So it's a pedantic point, but an important one, I think. If we're thinking about being research-based, then we're suggesting that everything we do is determined by the evidence. If we think about being research-informed, then we can go beyond the evidence. We can use what we can learn from the evidence, but we can go beyond that. We have to take seriously the critics, so we have to remember that context is important, situations are unique, and we need to trust our judgment. But we have a moral duty, maybe, to listen to the lessons from education research. And we need to do much more than that as well. We need to respect other forms of evidence, including professional practice. Where evidence does exist, I think maybe it's shameful not to be aware of it and not to use it. We have a duty, I think, to use it. If you think about the medical analogy again, if you go and see your doctor because you're unwell, you would be horrified if your doctor was not familiar with the latest evidence to treat your condition. But in the education field, it's not enough. We need to go beyond that. We can start to create our own evidence as well. We have a duty as professionals to be aware of authoritative research, but we can also create our own local evidence through teacher effectiveness and through professional learning communities in schools. So I've pointed out some of the problems, and one of those problems was that there's not enough evidence. There is actually some evidence, and there are some really good sources of evidence that can help to start us off in this field. Sorry, let me get back again. So there are some areas that we know quite a lot about, some topics that have been fairly exhaustively researched, and we know that these things matter. So, for example, an emphasis on metacognition, so asking students to reflect on their own learning, we know is a really powerful tool. We know the importance of diagnostic feedback in the classroom, and we know the importance of whole school questioning or dialogic teaching. And we also know how teachers learn best through the power of classroom-based coaching. And these are the kind of topics that we need to perhaps reflect on the evidence which is available. And where can we look? Well, I can draw your attention to a couple of places. First of all, the Education Endowment Foundation. So this is an English organisation that collates evidence. They conduct a whole range of research studies very rigorously, and they produce what they refer to as the toolkit. And this is a screenshot from the toolkit that shows just 3 of the approaches which have been looked at. There are lots more on the website. The toolkit gives you an idea, gives you a brief summary of the topic. It gives you an idea of the cost of implementing this approach, and the lock symbol gives you an idea about the quality of the evidence, and the green circle indicates the level of progress that the child would make above what you would expect without doing this. And if you're interested, you can click on these links and they will take you into the studies which sit behind the toolkit as well, so you can find out a lot more of the detail. There's another one as well, the Institute for Effective Education, which is a collaboration between the University of York and Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. And they produce fortnightly free briefings for teachers, which are very teacher-friendly, very easy to digest summaries of research. Okay, so we need to engage with evidence out there, but we also need to create new evidence, and how do we maybe do that? So we should use the insights from academic research, but we should combine these with lessons from personal experience, observation and discussion with others. We should also use non-academic data that we have at our fingertips too, such as systematically gathered feedback from students and parents and other school data that you collect in the daily running of the school. An evidence-engaged school, so perhaps this is taking a step beyond just being evidence-informed, but thinking also about going further than that. An evidence-engaged school would probably encourage staff to use authoritative academic research, but it would also promote collaborative practitioner inquiry amongst staff, perhaps use a range of evidence to inform decision-making at every level, and have an outward-looking orientation and make links with other research-based organisations and universities. So I've suggested that there might be a number of different levels at play here. So there's the first one being research-informed, the next level up might be research-engaged, and then potentially after that we're looking at the possibility of becoming evidence-led. The differences between these, I think, are important. So in a research-informed school, teachers would be well informed about the research. They would have a familiarity with the particular areas where good evidence does exist, and core school policies would be developed in line with evidence where that exists as well. So for example, if you're reviewing your special educational needs policy, there is a body of evidence that you can look at to inform how you take that forward. To be research engaged might require teachers to work collectively on local inquiries. So you might have evidence-engaged schools undertaking investigations using rigorous methods. And it's not difficult to do, but it does involve a slightly different skill set. So it might be that you have that skill set amongst some members of your staff team. If you don't have that, it's something perhaps you can gain. Or you can develop partnerships and friendships with other schools, other organisations, local universities that might be able to help you to bring that skill set into the school. And ultimately, I think leadership is really important as well, and there's a leadership perspective to all of this. If we can have schools which are evidence-led, where all key decisions are influenced by a whole range of different sources of evidence, I think that would be quite something. So going back to where we started, we need the rules, we need frameworks, we need monitoring. These things won't go away. It's part of our work, but it's not the basis necessarily of a satisfying professionalism. And I think we can go beyond this. We can create wonderful schools. We could have schools where there's professional trust, professional freedom, opportunities to create, and we can fulfill ourselves professionally. But we need to do this, I think, in a disciplined way. And disciplined innovation, I think, is closely connected with doing this in the right way. So we don't take too many risks. We take very calculated and very measured risks because we are, of course, dealing with children's education here. But maybe some of this is a recipe for to think about how we might create trust, freedom and respect in the profession, and potentially one day also earn greater pay. Thank you very much.